Today we're taking a look at what some have called the greatest game of Bobby Fischer's entire career. It's a positional masterpiece, described as being like a symphony by the great Miguel Najdorf, played with such brilliance and precision that after the game, Bobby Fischer's opponent, the sitting world champion Boris Spassky himself, felt compelled to join the audience in standing applause of his own defeat. So if that's not a testament to the greatness of this game, I don't know what is. But on top of that, Bobby Fischer's chosen opening in this game was one that he had zero experience with, at least when it came to serious tournament play, unlike Spassky, who was considered to be something of an expert in the opening. So what a thing to do, giving a world champion a masterclass in how to play his own opening in this famous Game 6 from the 1972 World Chess Championship, which we're going to dive into right now. Bobby Fischer, playing white, kicks off this epic struggle with the nearly impossible to predict c4, the English opening. Now he had played this move a couple of times before, but after e6 from Spassky, knight to f3 and d5, instead of remaining in English territory with the move g3, which is what he had previously played after opening with c4, Fischer makes the startling decision to play d4, steering the opening into a standard queen's gambit, which for him was unheard of. Bobby Fischer was a king's pawn man through and through, best by test. He's the one that came up with that. So to bust out the queen's gambit for the first time in his life in the World Championship, well, it's a bold move to say the least, and one that Spassky could have never anticipated, which undoubtedly was the whole point. Fischer knew that by playing this, he could rest assured that he would not be running into any special opening preparation by Spassky and his team. So play continues, knight to f6, knight to c3, bishop to e7, standard stuff, and now bishop to g5 from Fischer. A move that was a favorite of Boris Spassky's and one that he had an excellent track record with as white. In the 15 games I found in the database where Spassky played bishop to g5 here as white, he won 7 of them. So that's almost a 50% win rate. However, there were even more instances of Spassky playing this position as black, and his results in those games weren't nearly as impressive. Most of those ended in draws. I think Spassky won a couple and lost a couple. So none of this is an accident. Fischer had done his homework and was surely intimately familiar with the way Spassky was likely to handle this opening with black. And indeed, there were no surprises. Spassky stuck to what he knew by castling, and after e3, he continues h6, putting the question to the bishop, which Fischer chooses to keep on board with bishop to h4. Bishop takes knight is playable too, but it's going to take more than that to convince Fischer to part with one of his beloved bishops. Next we have b6, Spassky just doing what he always does. Quite literally, I couldn't find a single game in the database where he played anything else in this position, so apparently he has no fear of any potential opening prep by Fischer. Next is c takes d5 and knight takes d5, keeping the long light square diagonal nice and opened for his light squared bishop to potentially develop to b7, while also bringing the dark squared bishops into contact. So we have bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and now knight takes d5 played by Fischer before Spassky has the chance to put his bishop on b7 where it could recapture here on d5. And so Spassky must now close the long light square diagonal with e takes d5, which of course means that it's no longer going to be ideal to put his bishop on b7, where it will only be staring at its fellow comrade on d5. Which is why after Fischer develops his rook to the half-open file with rook to c1, Spassky puts his bishop on e6 instead, where it has a little more scope, having the c8 h3 diagonal to work with. Now you might wonder why not put the bishop on f5? Wouldn't that be an even more active square? Well, yes it would, and that move is playable, but bishop to e6 defends d5, and so prepares c5 next, when black will not lose a pawn to d takes c5 followed by queen takes d5. Fischer responds with the main book move, queen to a4, with the plan of meeting Spassky's c5 with queen to a3, now applying more pressure to the c5 pawn while pinning it to the black queen. And Spassky had actually reached this position with the black pieces before, back in 1966 in a game with Petrosian, who after Spassky's rook to c8 continued with the mainline bishop to e2. But here Fischer plays a bit of a novelty with the move bishop to b5. Now this move had been seen at least once before. It was played in 1970 by the Soviet Grandmaster Furman, but it hadn't really caught on. Most players were still preferring bishop to e2, But this puts the bishop on a much more active square, with the idea of possibly trading it off for black's knight once it ventures from the b8 square, which is not something you typically see from Fischer, but here there is some logic to it, which we're going to see in a few moves. And if you're wondering about the move a6, now played by Spassky, attacking the bishop, well, it doesn't really attack the bishop since that a pawn is pinned to the rook. So Fischer just leaves this bishop where it is, plays d takes c5, and after b takes c5, he just castles. Now if black were to continue by developing his knight, let's say to d7, which is not what happened in the game, then white could continue bishop takes d7, removing a defender of c5, and after bishop takes d7, there's knight to d4, taking advantage of the fact that the c-pawn is still pinned to the queen, with the idea of rerouting to b3 and applying more pressure to the c5 pawn. But the engine says black is doing just fine here. After queen to f8, breaking the pin on the c-pawn, since the black queen is defended, and after knight to b3, that c-pawn can just be pushed to c4. When after queen takes f8 check, king takes f8, and knight to d4, black's bishop is looking kind of bad, lacking active diagonals, with his own pawns blocking the center, and white's knight is looking pretty awesome on that d4 outpost, but the engine is actually giving total equality here. White has the weak pawn on b2, and the white knight doesn't actually have any attacking prospects since all of its forward squares are firmly under control by black's bishop. But in the game, Spassky, probably feeling a little sketched out by that variation we just looked at, waits on developing his knight and goes for rook to a7, giving his rook some defense by the queen and vice versa, unpinning his c-pawn and so preventing a potential knight to d4, also threatening to capture the bishop on b5 since the a6 pawn is no longer pinned. So Fischer needs to move his bishop. It could go to a4, keeping that idea of trading bishop for knight alive, but Fischer plays bishop to e2, after which you might be wondering what was even accomplished by moving the bishop to b5, since now it's sitting on e2, why not just move it there to begin with? Well, in order to drive that bishop off of b5, Spassky did have to make a couple of moves that otherwise wouldn't have been his first choice. That is, rook to a7 and a6. In his game with Petrosian, who played the main line with bishop to e2 right away, Spassky ended up playing a5 and knight to a6 instead. And the engine is actually saying that a5 is still good here, preparing knight to a6. Knight to c6 is of course a no-go, since it blocks the defense of the c-pawn, but Spassky decides to develop his knight immediately to d7, which objectively is okay, but it does give Fischer an unnecessary opportunity due to the fact that the black queen is no longer defended by the rook on a7, and so Fischer is now able to play knight to d4, taking advantage of the fact that black's c-pawn is now once again pinned to his queen. Now a good move for black here, maybe best, would be knight to f6. You'll see why in a moment, but it may be that Spassky wanted to keep his knight on d7, defending c5 in view of the move knight to b3, applying more pressure to c5. So Spassky just drops his queen back to f8, where it is defended, unpinning his c-pawn, and so threatening to take out the knight on d4. To which Fischer responds with the strongest move, which is not knight to b3 to try to pressure that well-defended c-pawn, but rather knight takes e6. And after f takes e6, he uncorks another ruthlessly accurate move, certified by Stockfish as best in the position. If you've never seen this game, feel free to pause the video and see if you can spot it. It's not very obvious, but the move is e4, hitting the black center. And this is the reason why playing knight to f6 a couple of moves ago would have been a bit preferable to queen to f8, since it would render this move e4 unplayable due to knight takes e4. So what's the deal with this move e4, and why would it have been most prudent for black not to allow it? Well, white doesn't have any huge threats here, but if black allows the pawn trade on d5, then the position is starting to open up. You know, fewer central pawns generally favors the side with the bishop over the side with the knight. Additionally, black will have the hanging c and d pawn structure, which white can easily put pressure on with his well-coordinated pieces. He's got the half-opened c and d files ready to go for his rooks. The engine is liking the looks of bishop to g4 with some awkward pressure along this diagonal, threatening to come into e6 with check to pick up the d5 pawn, stuff like that. So how should black react to this? Well, as usual, the engine has some thoughts. Believe it or not, black can actually get away with playing d takes e4. After which the less experienced player might think, duh, free pawn. But can you imagine a worse pawn structure for black? It could be a bit worse, but not much. None of these pawns can defend each other, and it's pretty hard to imagine a world in which white won't pick up at least one of them, after which black's remaining pawns will still be terribly weak, but the engine's actually claiming that white is only slightly better here. If rook to c4 hitting e4, then black can defend with queen to f5. If white continues to increase pressure with rook to c1, then in some lines black will play knight to f6, giving up his c-pawn so that he can post the knight on d5 next. The engine has it all worked out, but no human in their right mind is going to be too stoked about playing a position like this as black. So let's look at a more human option, shall we? The best practical try, suggested by Tal, just might be c4, offering a queen trade, which white is going to want to avoid being the attacking side. So after queen to h3 attacking e6, black has several defensive options, none of which are easy, and only one of which appears to be any good, and that is knight to c5, defending e6. Now white does have this move b4 attacking the knight, and after c takes b3 en passant and a takes b3, b4 is again threatened. So Stockfish is giving rook to d8, so that after b4, knight takes e4, and queen takes e6 check, d5 is defended, when black is supposedly okay. If, of course, in the almighty Stockfish we continue to place our unquestioning faith and trust. But now let's get to what Spassky tries in the game, which is d4, a colossal mistake, which I imagine a lot of players would be tempted to make in this position. I mean, who doesn't want to be the proud owner of a passed pawn? I want that bumper sticker, but the cost here is way too high. Spassky has relinquished all control of the c4 square, just gifting it to Fischer's bishop, which will set up shop there shortly, but not yet. Bobby Fischer is a master of timing, and he knows that it's best to begin with the move f4, planning e5 next, just to fix that pawn on e6 before attacking it. Now, if he were to jump the gun and play bishop to c4 too soon, then Spassky could just defend e6 and then play knight to b6, attacking the bishop on c4 before it has the chance to do anything nasty. Now, if the black queen weren't opposite the rook on f1, then black could actually equalize with the move e5, but here f takes e5 comes with the discovered attack, the queen's got to move, so after queen to e7, black is not going to have time to pick up that e5 pawn after bishop to c4 check, after which white will have his choice of either e6 or rook to f7, both of which are absolutely crushing. So in the game, what Spassky tries is queen to e7, now threatening to play the equalizing e5, so Fischer plays e5 himself, per the plan, fixing that pawn on e6. This looks very natural, but this is one of the few moments in the game where Fischer's play could have actually been improved upon, since his strongest move here is queen to h3, eyeing e6, threatening e5 next, followed by bishop to c4, targeting e6 further, and if knight to b6 to try to hold up bishop to c4, then white can play the immediate f5, attacking the e6 pawn that way, which may not move, lest black lose his knight to queen to b3 check. Additionally, there's the threat of f6, breaking apart the black king's pawn cover. If g takes f6, then queen takes h6 is going to be very bad. So let's contrast this to the move played in the game, which is e5. This allows black an improved knight to b6, which unfortunately for Spassky he did not play, but this move would have made the win much more difficult for Fischer. The engine is now giving queen to d3 with the idea of going to e4 and then forming the dangerous battery towards the black king with bishop to d3, when black's best defense just might have to be queen to e8, followed by sacking the g-pawn with g6. But let's look at what happens if white tries f5 here. Unlike the position where white's queen was on h3, black can now equalize with the move c4, threatening a queen trade, threatening d3, when here the move f6 would be quite harmless. But now let's take a look at Spassky's big blunder, which after Fischer's e5 is rook to b8. Okay, he's putting his rook on a half-open file, eyeing b2, but this allows Fischer's bishop into c4, pinning the pawn on e6, threatening to attack it further with f5. King to h8 unpins the pawn, but here comes queen to h3, hitting the pawn a second time. Now Spassky could capture the pawn on b2, and that might actually even be his best chance, since at least he'd be doing something active, but he's correctly determined that after bishop takes e6, White's kingside pawn duo is going to be much more problematic than his queenside pawn duo. There's also the ever-present threat of White setting up the queen and bishop battery towards his king along this light square diagonal. So with that in mind, his next move, knight to f8, is an understandable try. Defending e6, defending h7, still threatening rook takes b2, so Fischer takes care of that with b3, leaving Spassky in a pretty sorry state. He tries to get some play on the queen side with a5, going for a4 I guess, but here comes f5, hitting e6 a third time, threatening f6 to undermine that defensive h6, wouldn't want that. So e takes f5 is pretty much forced. Fischer recaptures with the rook, threatening to double up and then infiltrate on f7, but he's not threatening rook to f7 right away, since queen to g5 would be an effective counterattack, hitting the rook on c1. So just a fun fact for you. Spassky continues knight to h7, just getting out of the way of the incoming rook battery with rook c to f1, so that he can play queen to d8 when f8 is adequately defended, and so is f7 for the moment, since rook to f7 here would run into rook takes f7, followed by knight to g5, forking queen and rook. Fischer notices that little issue, so he gets his queen out of the way now with queen to g3, eyeing g7, so that if and when he lands a rook on f7, it's going to come with the threat of checkmate. Spassky continues rook to e7, getting in front of the passed pawn. We have h4 from Fischer, exercising patience, since if he were to play an immediate rook to f7, then after the rook trade, black would have knight to g5, blocking his queen's access to g7 with an attack on the rook. So h4 just eliminates that possibility, pretty much shutting Spassky's knight right out of the game. Next is rook b to b7, makes sense, adding more coverage to the f7 square, but here comes Elmer the e-pawn. Is it Elmer? I think Simon Williams calls it something else, but I really like Elmer. Anyway, next is rook b to c7. Why? Because black doesn't have anything better to do. All Spassky can really do at this point is just sit tight and wait for his imminent demise. His rooks are tied down to defending the f7 square. If his queen leaves the back rank, then rook to f8 check will result in a rapid mate. His knight can go to f6, but that would go down in flames pretty quickly to an exchange sacrifice with rook takes f6. Fischer continues queen to e5, taking protection off of the d3 square, but if Spassky were to push his pawn there, then rook to f3 followed by rook to d3 would just pick it up. So he plays queen to e8, which doesn't really do anything besides fulfill the requirement to make a move. If a4, then white can just capture and black has accomplished nothing. But Fischer doesn't even want Spassky to have that option. He wants to keep him in a state of utter paralysis, hence his move a4. After which, we reach a sad, yet rather comical situation where Spassky has become completely powerless to do anything but just move his queen back and forth, starting with queen to d8. At which point Fischer, as if to emphasize just how total his stranglehold is on the black position, decides to take two moves to get his rook to f3 instead of just one, starting with rook 1 to f2. Now it could be that Fischer is trying to time it so that he can play rook to f3 after Spassky puts his queen back on e8, which he now does, so that after rook 2 to f3, then after Spassky's move queen back to d8, his e6 pawn is only attacked once, and so he can play bishop to d3 without any possibility of rook takes e6 by Spassky. Not that that would even come close to saving him, since for one thing it would leave his rook on c7 hanging. So this two-move journey to f3 by the rook is probably mainly just Fischer emphasizing to the entire world just how total his domination of this position is. And now his move bishop to d3 is preparing to set up the dreaded queen and bishop battery. Spassky plays queen back to e8, and we have queen to e4, threatening a double rook sack on f8, followed by queen to h7 checkmate, so something must be done. Spassky plays knight to f6, but now comes rook takes f6, and after g takes f6 and rook takes f6, Fischer is threatening rook takes h6 check, to which there is no good defense. If king to g7, then queen to e5 will force mate in another 10 moves, threatening a deadly discovered check, so hanging out on g7 is not going to save the king. Spassky realizes this and instead plays king to g8, but after bishop to c4, adding defense to e6, and threatening a discovered check if the rook on e7 were to move, Spassky plays king to h8, getting off of that diagonal, but after queen to f4, hitting h6 with the queen, Spassky has seen quite enough and resigns the game. If rook to h7, adding defense, then rook to f8 check will win the black queen. The engine says that black can most effectively delay checkmate with the move queen to g8, so that after queen to e5, setting up the discovered check, he can sacrifice his queen on g2. But let's say he were to do the more human thing and try to block the discovered check with rook to g7. Well, then there's rook takes h6 check, when white can only block with the queen since the rook is pinned to the king. That's a mate in 5. Let's say you try blocking with the queen, like so. Then there's rook to f8 check, when the queen cannot capture, being pinned to the king. And so after king to h7 and bishop to d3 check, black's only move is queen to g6, after which queen to h8 is checkmate. So what a way for Bobby Fischer to take the lead in the World Chess Championship, stunning the world with an immortal masterpiece of such brilliance that Boris Spassky, after resigning this game like a true sportsman, stood with the audience and applauded Fischer's amazing performance. So I hope you enjoyed this. Consider subscribing to the channel if you want to see more like it in the near future. Leave a comment, hit the like button. That always helps the channel, and I will see you soon.